I'm Alma Arara Mountain, and the year my world cracked cleanly into before and after was the one when I turned 13. If you wanted me to mark the exact instant my family decided I was background scenery in my own story, it wouldn't be some slow dawning, just a sticky note stuck to the fridge. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. 15 years later, I am standing in the grand foyer of a Savannah estate worth $5.2 billion. My sisters, Taylor and Emma, walk in draped in expensive designer silk, their eyes already calculating the value of the mahogany surfaces as if they own the place. They expect the same quiet, responsible girl they abandoned over a decade ago. They expect tears and a seat at the table. Instead, I greet them with a cold stare and a stack of non-disclosure agreements. No hugs, no shared grief. I am not here to mourn with them, I am here to close the account. Melissa and Timothy stood at the base of the grand mahogany staircase, looking up as if the $5.2 billion estate was already their personal retirement playground. My mother, Melissa, adjusted her designer sunglasses, the same kind she used to wear to hide her eyes from the sight of me when I was 13, and started gesturing toward the west wing. She talked about which rooms would catch the morning sun and how she wanted the drapes changed to a softer cream. My father, Timothy, was already checking the weight of the silver ornaments on the side table, his fingers tracing the Carlton family crest with a hunger that was almost feral. They weren't here to mourn Uncle Richard, they were here to audit their winnings. They thought that because Richard was gone, the middle child would naturally step aside and let the real stars of the family take center stage again. I didn't let them get past the third step. I didn't raise my voice or show a flicker of the old, desperate need for their approval. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I stood there, leaning against the polished railing, and told them that the main house was closed to visitors. Melissa's face went from practiced grief to sharp confusion in less than 2 seconds. She tried to play the family card immediately, reminding me that they had traveled all the way from their luxury villa in Malibu to be here for the family legacy. She actually said the words, "family comes first," without a hint of irony. I looked at her and realized that for years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the emotional bill while they overextended their credit on my soul. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I reminded her of the last time I saw a note about family time. It was a sticky note on a fridge in a house that smelled like salt and indifference. While they were in Malibu, enjoying the high life and pretending their middle daughter didn't exist, I was learning that hunger counts as danger. I was learning that if you don't build your own walls, the people who claim to love you will simply walk over your ruins. The Savannah estate carried the scent of old leather and the kind of power that doesn't need to shout, a stark contrast to the cheap plastic souvenirs and the hollow, performative joy of our Malibu days. Timothy tried to bluster, talking about how Richard would want them to be comfortable. But I cut him off with the precision of an architect striking a failed line from a blueprint. I told them their luggage was being redirected to a hotel downtown. They weren't shocked by what they had done 15 years ago, they were simply shocked that I had stopped playing along. I watched them realize, for the first time, that the background scenery had finally become the landlord. I close my eyes and I am 13 again. The Malibu sun is too bright for a house that feels like a tomb. Most people think abandonment is a loud, shattering event. But for me, it was the sound of a humming refrigerator and the dry scratch of a sticky note against plastic. Melissa and Timothy hadn't just forgotten me, they had calculated my absence into their vacation budget. They headed to California the morning of my birthday, leaving a note that read like a casual errand instead of a cold betrayal. My sisters, Taylor and Emma, filled their social media feeds with photos of palm trees and matching designer luggage, while I sat on the porch and watched the streetlights flicker on like mocking eyes. By the fourth night, the hunger started offering its own louder logic. I became a raccoon in my own kitchen, crouching over a cereal box in the pitch black because I was afraid that turning on a light would count as trespassing. I didn't cry. Crying seemed like an extravagance I couldn't afford, a luxury for children who knew someone was coming to wipe their tears. I was living in a prison without bars, bound by the invisible chains of the survivor. This wasn't weakness, it was learned helplessness. I didn't leave because I had been conditioned to believe that my existence was a phase, not a future. It was the crushing silence of a child who has realized that her voice doesn't carry past the front door. I was 13, but I was already a ghost. I spent those nights convinced that if I just stayed quiet enough, I wouldn't be a burden when they finally decided to return. I didn't know then that Melissa and Timothy had actively blocked Uncle Richard's number and the numbers of our neighbors to prevent anyone from reporting my condition. They wanted their star act in Malibu to be completely drama-free. They didn't count on the neighbor who heard a child crying for 3 nights straight and Refused to stay silent, the neighbor spent the next 48 hours desperately trying to bypass the digital wall my parents had built, only to find the landline disconnected and their local contacts blocked. It wasn't until the morning of the 6th day that she managed to track down Richard's private office number through an old business directory, alerting him to the silence coming from our house. When Uncle Richard's glossy black car finally slowed to the curb on the 6th day, I didn't recognize him at first. I just saw a man who carried the scent of leather and the smell of money that hadn't gone stale. He didn't ask me if I was okay, he didn't offer clichés or empty comfort. He took in my backpack, my matted hair, and the way I held a simple glass of water as if it might break from being looked at wrong, and he understood everything. He leaned against the doorframe of that empty house and told me to pack a bag. He didn't treat me like a victim or a charity case. He looked at me and saw a work in progress. That was the day the invisible chains finally snapped. He was the only one who saw that I wasn't an extra piece in a family puzzle meant to be discarded. I was a person worth keeping in working order, and he was the only architect willing to sign the blueprints for my new life. Melissa and Timothy sat on the antique velvet sofa in the Savannah Library, looking exactly like the people who expect an apology for being found out. My mother, Melissa, smoothed her skirt and looked at me with a face that had been surgically altered to show concern. Though the muscles couldn't quite remember how to do it, she told me that I was being unfair. She actually sat there, surrounded by Richard's $5.2 billion legacy, and told me that the fridge note incident had been a strategic choice. "We knew you were the strong one, Alma," she said, her voice dripping with that toxic sweetness she used to call motherly love. "We left you behind to teach you independence. We wanted you to find your own feet without us hovering. It was a gift." I leaned against the mahogany desk, watching her through a lens of pure assessment. This was the trap of cruel normalization. They had spent years convincing themselves that my isolation was a test of character rather than a crime of neglect. To justify their own systemic indifference, they had to devalue me in their own minds. In their narrative, the star act, Taylor and Emma, needed the spotlight, and the background scenery didn't need a birthday dinner or a phone call. For 15 years, I wasn't a daughter to them. I was an extra piece that didn't fit their aesthetic, and they had spent a decade and a half normalizing the fact that they had simply thrown that piece away. My father, Timothy, chimed in, his tone shifting to that practice bluster he used for business deals. He told me that Richard was an eccentric old man who had clearly been manipulated in his final days. He suggested that Richard only took me in because he was lonely and that my so-called career in architecture was just a result of Richard's charity. Taylor and Emma didn't miss a beat. They stood by the fireplace, Taylor swirling a glass of expensive brandy she had no right to touch. She called my work as an architect a hobby, suggesting I was nothing more than a glorified draftsman who had spent years leeching off our uncle's bank account while they were out there actually living. They laughed, that same sharp, bright sound from the Malibu days, convinced that their social status and their bloodline gave them a permanent seat at the table. I didn't answer a single one of their insults. I didn't defend my degree or my portfolio. I simply went back to my internal spreadsheet. My compassion for them had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades, and the account was now permanently closed. They thought they were still in control, still the protagonists of the story, but the star act was over. The scavengers were starting to realize the theater was empty, and the only person with the keys to the exit was the girl they had labeled as background scenery. Mr. Halpern's office smelled like expensive ink and quiet retribution, a sanctuary of dark oak where every breath felt like testimony. He sat at the head of a mahogany table that had seen more billionaire deals than most people see bank statements in a lifetime. He didn't look at me with pity or misplaced concern. He looked at me with the professional respect reserved for a high-value partner. For the last 6 years, I had been Richard's silent hand, managing his vast real estate holdings and property acquisitions while Melissa and Timothy were busy posing for pictures in Malibu. The family thought I was background scenery, but I was the structural integrity of the entire Carlton empire. I sat across from him, tracing the engraved initial on the silver pen Richard had given me when I graduated at the top of my architecture class. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need volume to exert power. I told Halpern it was time to move from observation to a full-scale audit. I wanted every cent of the so-called boarding school fees Richard had provided tracked down to the penny. For 12 years, Richard had believed he was funding a prestigious education for the niece my parents claimed was away. To keep the checks coming for over a decade, Melissa and Timothy had fabricated a grand lie, telling Richard that after I finished boarding school, I had been fast-tracked into an exclusive master's and Ph.D. architectural program in Europe. They maintained this fiction for years, sending him forged transcripts and fake updates to justify the increasing tuition fees. and living expenses, they were actually pocketing thousands of dollars had been sent every month, money intended to secure my future. But I had already seen the ledger of their betrayal. Melissa and Timothy hadn't just forgotten me, they had stolen from me, they had diverted my education funds into Taylor's sorority dues, Emma's designer wardrobe, and the renovations of their Malibu villa while I was working 3 separate jobs just to pay for my own degree. This wasn't a family drama anymore, it was accounting. I directed Halpern to initiate a forensic audit of every wire transfer and every diverted check. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a flicker of regret for what I was about to do to them, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I was the architect of my own life now, and I was about to execute a professional siege on the people who had treated my existence as an inconvenient expense. By the time they realized the Star Act was over, I would have stripped them of the only currency they understood: calm, factual, lethal. The reckoning was no longer a personal hope, it was a legal certainty. The office grew so quiet that I could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of the trees against the window glass, a sound that felt like the sharp ticking of a clock counting down to their final ruin. Mr. Halpern didn't say a word as he slid a single, laminated document across the mahogany desk toward me. It was a withdrawal authorization for a trust fund account I hadn't even realized existed until 2 hours ago. My eyes locked onto the bottom right corner, where a signature supposed to belong to Richard Carlton was scrawled in black ink, but the loops were too wide, the pressure was too heavy, and the final stroke didn't taper the way Richard always insisted his did. I didn't need a forensic expert to tell me what I was looking at. This was a signature mismatch. This was a forgery. 3 years ago, while I was finishing my master's degree and eating dinner out of a cardboard box, Melissa and Timothy had accessed my private trust and withdrawn $125,000. They hadn't just forgotten me, they had systematically looted my future to fund the very life they used to mock me. Halpern pulled up a digital folder of receipts he had uncovered during the audit. The $125,000 hadn't gone toward property taxes or business investments, it had been used to pay for Emma's destination wedding in Italy. My money had paid for the champagne they drank while they toasted to the perfect family. My money had paid for the designer dress Emma wore while she laughed about her invisible older sister. I felt a wave of clarity wash over me, colder than the Savannah air. This wasn't a family dispute anymore, this was the kill shot. It removed any remaining path to redemption for them. They weren't just ungrateful or indifferent, they were criminals who had stolen from a child they once abandoned. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal this time, I felt the satisfaction of a blueprint finally aligning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver pen Richard had given me. I uncapped it with a slow, deliberate movement. The weight of it felt substantial, a piece of structural integrity in a room full of lies. I didn't hesitate, I didn't ask Halpern if there was another way. I pressed the nib to the police report and signed my name with lethal precision. As I handed the document back to my attorney, I realized that the Star Act was about to face a very different kind of audience. This wasn't revenge, it was the final entry on a balance sheet that had been in the red for 15 years. The Savannah Library was a room built for history, not for the scavengers currently occupying the velvet chairs. Melissa sat there, dabbing at her eyes with a designer tissue that probably cost more than the groceries she left me with 15 years ago. Taylor and Emma were leaning forward, their eyes darting across the room as if they were already mentally tagging the antiques for an auction block. They were vibrating with an anticipation that was almost feral. They expected the $5.2 billion estate to be their reward for a decade of systematic indifference. Mr. Halpern did not smile as he opened the leather-bound folder. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, looking at them with the cold precision of a surgeon about to remove a tumor. He cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room like a gunshot. He began reading the final testament of Richard Carlton. For the first 5 minutes, it was all technicalities, donations to architectural foundations and gifts for the staff who had actually cared for him. I could see Timothy's jaw tightening. He did not want to hear about charity, he wanted the numbers. Then Halpern reached the final clause. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He read slowly, each word crisp as glass. To my estranged relatives who remembered me only when my bank balance suited their needs, I leave the only thing you ever truly valued, nothing. The explosion was immediate. Melissa shrieked, jumping to her feet, her surgically altered face contorting into a mask of pure fury. She screamed that it was not fair, that Richard was not in his right mind, and that family comes first. She looked at me and spat that I was a manipulative child who had poisoned an old man's mind. Taylor was shouting about contesting the will, her voice high-pitched and shrill against the quiet dignity of the library. I did not blink, I did not feel the old urge to apologize for taking up space. I stood up and slid a copy of the police report across the mahogany surfaces they had been so eager to claim. I pointed to the entry for the $125,000 trust fund forgery. The room went silent again, but this time it was the silence of a trap snapping shut. I looked my mother in the eye and delivered the finisher. "You once told me my presence at your events would be complicated," I said, my voice clinical and lethal. "It is about to get much more complicated for your lawyers." I watched her hands begin to shake as she realized the star act was over. As two security guards stepped forward to escort them out of my house, I realized that justice was not a feeling, it was an entry on a balance sheet that finally read 0. The legal fallout for Melissa and Timothy was swift and clinical. The evidence of the $125,000 forgery was undeniable, and the authorities had no intention of being as lenient as I had been for 15 years. They are currently navigating a reality where their reputation is as hollow as the bank account they tried to loot. My brother-in-law, Gregory, has already initiated divorce proceedings against Emma to distance himself from the scandal, but I don't spend my time checking their status updates. My accounting with them is finished. I have turned the Savannah estate into the Richard Carlton Center for Misplaced Children. It is more than just a sanctuary, it is a premier architecture school for kids who are told they were just background scenery. We teach them that they aren't visitors in their own lives. We teach them how to design their own foundations so they never have to rely on the unstable structures of people who don't see them. This is the justice of the seed sower. For a long time, I thought justice meant watching my parents suffer for every night I spent hungry, but Uncle Richard taught me that true justice isn't found in the destruction of the old, it's found in what you build on the ground they tried to take from you. My victory isn't the $5.2 billion, it's the fact that I am using that wealth to ensure no other child has to forage for cereal in the dark or wait on a porch for a birthday message. That never comes. Last night, I sat in Richard's old leather armchair, the smell of mahogany and pipe tobacco still clinging to the air like a warm embrace. I opened my laptop and found the digital folder titled The Mountains. It was full of years of evidence, the screenshots of their Malibu vacations, the records of diverted funds, and the scan of that original sticky note from my 13th birthday. I stared at the icons for a long moment, my finger steady on the mouse. Then, I hit delete, no hesitation, no surge of regret. The world didn't end, and there was no dramatic noise, there was only the quiet, absolute satisfaction of a completed project. I am no longer the misplaced child clutching a backpack, I am the architect, and I am finally writing my own chapter. If you've ever had to build your own home because the one you were born into didn't have a room for you, you're not alone. Share this story with someone who needs to know they are the architect of their own life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience.